Hello, you are listening to Through Time and Clades. My name is Albert,
And I'm Joan.
and today is the first episode we're recording in November. So, we are going to do another one of our news episodes. Of course, there are many major recent events going on right now. It is quite a stressful time for a lot of people, I think, for pretty much the entire world, because everybody's going to be affected by this. But nonetheless, science hasn't stopped yet, so we do have some news stories about interesting scientific discoveries that caught our eye from the past month. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. I've been, yeah, like as you say, it's a little bit of a stressful time for a lot of us, and I've been doing my part to help my anxiety by
Hmm.
just kind of casually catching up with things and not being glued to a Twitter screen for hours upon hours, much less a
Right.
television screen. But yeah, no, I there's a lot of exciting discoveries to talk about, and we hope that we can give you all a little bit of reprieve from all the events of the day by kind of just hanging out with us and seeing this new information.
Yeah, definitely. Um, so as it happens over here in the UK, it is currently a holiday called Guy Fawkes Night, and so a tradition of this holiday is to put on fireworks. So if you hear any fireworks in the background, that's the reason why. Um, just so you know.
Sure.
Uh, but other than that, I guess if you don't have anything else to add, we can probably get started, right?
Yeah, let's jump right in.
All right, let's go on to the first news item. Okay, as usual, we've each picked out two different science-related news items that came out during the past month, the month of October. So the first of my news items is about a group of very obscure rodents. So if you know me at all, you know that I kind of have a strong focus on Maniraptor and theropod dinosaurs, but if you know me well, then you also know that I have a bit of a soft spot for rodents. I think rodents are very interesting and diverse and underappreciated in terms of those aspects of their biology. So, this particular group of rodents is a very unusual and interesting group, but they are not very well known. So, I actually first learned about this group of rodents from a blog post, as usual, by good old Darren Naish of Tetrapod Zoology. So he once wrote a blog post on the. It was on like the very earliest iteration of his blog. Um, so the blog Tetrapod Zoology has gone through several different versions, I guess you could say. So originally it was hosted on like a typical blogspot platform, and that was like the version one of Tetrapod Zoology, and that's where I read about these mice. But since then, Tetrapod Zoology has migrated to various other platforms, and currently it's hosted on its own platform, tetsu.com. So um, it's had quite a long history. But in any case, these very obscure mice are uh, they come in two genera, both from Central Africa, and one of these genera is Nilopegames, and the other one is Colomys. Now, each of these genera have long been assumed, until recently, to each contain a single species. And what makes these mice quite unusual is that they are amphibious. They have amphibious habits. Um, so they are very, very difficult to study in the wild. In fact, Nilopegames has not been cited. There's no scientific documentation of it since 1927 when it was originally collected by Western scientists. So there's even a possibility it might be extinct.
Hmm.
Yeah. So it has actually never really been seen alive, or at least not in the scientific literature. So we suspect it is amphibious because it has certain features that seem to indicate that it has very broad feet that seem good for swimming, very sleek waterproof-looking fur, and apparently, when people cut its stomach open, it smelled like fish. So
Oh.
that's why it's thought to be amphibious. Now, Colomys has been observed alive on several occasions and has been kept, at least for short periods, in captivity. So a little bit more is known about it. And Colomys, unusually enough, it doesn't seem to be specialized for swimming underwater, which is very odd. So there are a number of other semi-aquatic mice and rat species from all over the world. There are a number in South America. There are some in Australasia. But a lot of these other amphibious rats and mice, they swim underwater and they catch fish, they catch mollusks and crustaceans and things by swimming and diving. But Colomys, what it seems to do is that it doesn't like to swim in deep water. It avoids deep water, even if you put food there. It just doesn't like to approach it. Instead, what it does is that it stands around in the shallows and has these rather long feet. So it wades, into the water and stands itself up on its hind limbs, raising its body out of the water. And while it's doing this, it keeps its whiskers close to the surface of the water to try and detect prey. And if it detects any kind of motion using its whiskers, it will pounce down into the water and catch whatever it's trying to catch. So this can be small fish or aquatic insects, small prey like that. So it fills a very unusual kind of niche. It's basically a wading mouse. Um, it has been suggested that this is because there are a number of semi-aquatic shrew species that already live in Central Africa, and because of this, Colomys has not broken into a kind of swimming and diving niche, and instead has taken on this very unusual kind of lifestyle that I don't think is seen in any other type of rodent, at least not that I recall. Whereas Nilopegames is only known from kind of highlands in Ethiopia, where there don't seem to be any semi-aquatic shrew species. So it is thought that Nilopegames is a more typical kind of swimming and diving species. But of course, it hasn't been seen alive or documented in terms of its habits. So it's hard to be sure, really. The taxonomy of these mice has also been a little rocky, I guess. Nilopegames at one point was actually synonymized with Colomys, thought to be the same animal. But some various revisions comparing kind of the original specimens of these two different mice have established that they are probably distinct. But nonetheless, Nilopegames has not been included in any kind of recent phylogenetic analyses until recently, and so it hasn't been incorporated into a lot of like the molecular studies that have been going on, trying to figure out where all the different mammals of the world fit into the phylogeny of mammals. So what this study did was they did just that. So they managed to get some DNA out of the original specimen of Nilopegames. So there you go. There's a bit of a lesson there in the importance of museum collections.
Mm-hmm.
And they also sampled they also took samples from many specimens of Colomys from all over the world's museums. It is a bit better known and better collected than Nilopegames is. Right. So let's see. Before we move on and talk about what they found, I guess I just want to draw attention to the fact that the image I chose on this slide, so this is part of the new paper where they studied the phylogenetic relationships of these mice. And if you look closely, you might notice that this is not a photo of a mouse. So it's meant to be Colomys. And it turns out that there are so few photos of like a living Colomys that instead of like using an actual photo, they actually commissioned an artist to draw a picture of one to use.
They picked a really great artist.
Yeah, yeah. I know he also does paleo art too. Believes our Simeon Novitsky. Hopefully, I'm saying that right. Yeah, so he does a lot of the technique is called photo bashing. So taking photographs of animals and kind of putting them digitally together to form images of another kind of animal you want to depict, which is not always a very easy to pull off. So yeah, it is a quite nice illustration in this instance. Um, yeah, so that kind of tells you something about how hard it is to study these mice in the wild. All right, I guess we can go to the next slide now.
Alrighty.
So let's talk a bit about what they found. So they included, all these different samples of Colomys they took, and they took the original specimen of Nylopegames and put them onto a molecular phylogenetic analysis. And what they found was that they found support for there being not just one species of Colomys, as was originally thought, but four separate species. Now, as you know, and as we probably alluded to in this podcast in the past, kind of deciding when a species is distinct enough from its close relatives to be considered a separate species is a bit of a tricky kind of thing to do, and there's very little agreement among biologists on how to do it. But nonetheless, what they found was that they could identify kind of four different clusters of distinct populations of Colomys from their genetics. Not only that, they found that the geographic distribution of these four different clusters was mostly separate between them. So you can see that's what it's showing on the map here. It might be a little bit hard to see at this size, but the different colored dots are basically where the different what they call separate species of Colomys were collected. And as you can see, for most part, they're pretty well segregated. There's one group in the far Western Africa, and then another one kind of in the center. And then there's a very wide ranging species that fills much of the kind of east to mid eastern region, and it sort of overlaps with a fourth species, the purple dots. But nonetheless, several of these populations seem pretty well segregated from each other, and furthermore, they were also able to identify seemingly consistent morphological differences when looking at kind of the preserved museum specimens as well. So I've listed here the four different species they identified. So Colomys goslingi is the kind of the original, the OG Colomys species, the one that was originally named. So if you want to distinguish the other ones, you basically make comparisons to this and this original one and say, what can you say that seems to be different about these? And so one of the new species that they named is Colomys lumumbi, and it is quite similar to goslingi, but it seems to have some range overlap with it, possibly. It's hard to tell because, of course, we haven't sampled across the entire, probably the entire distribution of these mice because they're so hard to study.
Mm.
But you can see the purple dots are lumumbi, and the yellow dots are goslingi. So there's potentially a little bit of overlap there. But they were able to find that they do have some morphological differences. Especially in some of the proportions of the skull, lumumbi especially has a large projection in front of the cheekbone that is not really seen in goslingi. So they figured that this was sufficient to consider it a separate species. The third species is Colomys eisentrauti. I don't know if I'm saying that right either, but this was originally considered a subspecies of the goslingi, but they elevated it here to its own species. This is the largest member of the genus out of the ones they studied, and it has especially long skull and an especially long skull and feet, and a little bit of a hairbrush at the tip of its tail, so that distinguishes it from the other species here. And then they also named a second new species called Wallogizai. This is the westernmost species, the green dots on the map, and it is also the smallest species. So that's kind of interesting. So with a very short tail and a skull, or at least relatively compared to the others. And something interesting that they mentioned in the paper is that basically the type specimen of Wallogizai was collected by one of the authors on this paper on a field expedition, and the specimen was collected. It was seen when it was climbing in the trees overhead of the
Wow.
collector. So this demonstrates that at least in this species, Colomys is known to climb trees, which is pretty interesting because I'm not sure if that behavior has been documented before. And they suggested that this behavior might help Colomys avoid times when the rivers are overflowing and the water is flowing very, very fast. I mentioned earlier that Colomys does not like to swim in deep water. They are able to swim, but they will avoid deep water if they can help it. And possibly a reason for this is that the rivers where they live can, be very fast flowing at times, and so potentially they could hide in the trees to escape overflowing of rivers. And it's pretty. I mean, of course, no one has actually seen them do this, but it is a pretty reasonable hypothesis. And finally, as for Nilopegames, they were able to confirm that it is a distinct species from all the Colomys species. And furthermore, what they found was that it is the closest living relative to Colomys. So they formed this kind of clade of African amphibious mice, which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's all I have to say about this paper. Do you have anything else you want to add?
I think it's pretty fascinating that, like, this is sort of more evidence to show how in tropical regions like the Central African rainforests, the species are a lot more diverse than maybe in the more northerly or southerly temperate regions.
Right.
And on to the poles. You mentioned like they hadn't had the chance to really go into this area deeply and get more and more samples from across
Right.
the range. So I wouldn't be surprised if further study on this particular group would more further complicate things.
Yes.
And maybe there's more species.
Right. Yeah, I would agree with that. And you can see here that maybe you can see here it's a bit tricky to tell at the scale and the color, but there are some gray dots on the map, and those are the specimens where they couldn't be sure if they were which species they were. So they could be Lumumbi or a gosling eye, but hard to tell. And also there's a lone black dot up in the northeastern part in Ethiopia, and that is the type locality of Nilopegames.
All by itself.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Do wonder. Hopefully, it is not extinct, and we can eventually observe it in the wild. It would be a big find in mammalogy to see a living Nilopegames.
Oh yeah, and I mean like this is, I mean honestly, this is a phenomena that happens a lot.
Yeah.
We don't see a species for a while, and then we presume extinction as an option, but it's almost likely that there's just not work that's being done here, or it may have been a mistake, like
Right.
it's been missed, and it'll eventually be rediscovered at some point.
Yeah, that certainly happens a lot. We can hope. I think another point they make is that in some of the regions where these species are known from, so like Colomys, Wallagizai, the obviously the habitats they live in seem to have high levels of endemism. So as far as we know, like these specific species of mice are only restricted to that one area, and there's evidence for that in other types of organisms that live in the same region as well. But many of these regions have not been given any kind of official protected status. So they do mention in the paper that it would be important to establish protections for those environments and protect these unique assemblages of fauna and flora.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, almost certainly the indigenous groups in these regions are already helping out as much as they can by living and guarding in these areas where these animals live.
Right.
So we just have to encourage
Indeed.
that more and more.
Absolutely. Okay. I guess if there's nothing else either of us have left to say on this, we can move on to your first story.
Sure, absolutely. So let's go to the next slide here. Okay, so finding fossil footprints of any organism is always a treat, because there's quite a lot of information you can get from trackways that is often lost from body fossils. You get impressions on the weight of the organism, the length of the stride, and the probable speed. possible traces of behavior. Not to mention, an idea of what the soft tissues of the feet look like. And footprints of hominins are especially exciting because of what they can tell about our own story and where we've been. I mean, it's quite literally evidence that we set foot here.
Right, right.
That can't be more definitive than that, I think, unless you find an actual body. Now, there have been footprints of humans and other close relatives on all the continents of various ages and species. I mean, we have great trackways of afarensis in eastern Africa that have given us a lot of information. Now, the exciting story I've chosen to tell is of a newly described set of trackways from the White Sands National Park in New Mexico. This is a increasingly studied site that is yielding a lot of fascinating insights into the world of the end of the Pleistocene epoch. So these particular trackways date to about 13,000 years ago. And given the location of the trackway, and of course what we know of North American archaeology, that the track makers were almost certainly members of our own species, Homo sapiens, being one of the Amerindian groups that settled on the continent. We're usually known as Paleoindians in some of the literature. Of course, this was many thousands of years prior, but again, that's a bit of a loaded discussion for another time. So, what do we have here? Well, the prints are preserved in what's known as a playa, which is basically the dried up remains of a lake. And so when this human was moving through the ground, it would have been all muddy and sticky and wet, which is good for us because that's a great place to preserve tracks. The footprints themselves are of varying quality. We have obvious traces of the entire foot here, including some tracks that show impressions of the toes, and you can kind of see that in some of the photos here on the right. But others are a lot less clear. So it's a bit of an open question as to whether this person was going about barefoot or whether they had some sort of thin footwear. Moccasins and rawhide sandals were common among Native American groups, but there were also others that went without shoes, even in the high north where it gets a lot colder than here.
Oh, wow.
And of course, we don't know when this technology was developed, much less whether it was actually brought into the Americas or whether it was made independently here. I did some digging around in the literature, and according to the archaeological record, incidentally, the oldest preserved American shoes come from Missouri, and they are 7,500 years old. Huh. And these were made from fibers or perhaps leather-bound sandals. The material is a little bit hard to tell definitively. But in any case, whether it's fiber or leather, that sort of material rarely preserves in most environments. So whether this person was actually sporting footwear, it's really hard to tell. I bring all this up only because, I look at these tracks and they really don't look like other old human footprints that we've found, where the preservation is a lot more clear to say that, oh, this person was wearing shoes. Oh, or this person was going around barefoot. I mean, Pleistocene, New Mexico, according to the research that's been done at the White Sands National Park, and this is towards the tail end of the Ice Age, we know it was very cool and it was very wet, and it was often raining and snowing a lot more than what you normally find today in New Mexico. So I think it certainly would be helpful to be a little bit more protected in this sort of environment. But again, it's hard to say. Tangent. Let's move on to the next slide here. So this site, you can see a longer photograph of the tracks here. This site has been determined to have been the lengthiest trackway of any hominin known. The footprints go on for a total of over 1.5 kilometers, so that's almost a mile. And they don't go all one way. So the individual who made these tracks was moving in a straight line direction, and then later on just took that same route back with the same sort of strict direction it was going. So person going this way, person going that way, with no derivations. And I mean, there are some hints of personality here, which is kind of fun.
Yeah.
you can see where this individual slipped on the mud, for example, or maybe kind of stretched their stride a bit to step over a puddle or something, maybe a rock. So that's pretty cool. And what's really neat is at a few points on this trackway, and you can see I've circled them with these red circles here. These tiny little footprints just show up out of nowhere, and they disappear, and then they reappear at successive sequences. So it seems 100% then that we have an adult, or at least an adolescent human, holding on to a child. And they were carrying them around in their arms, or maybe over their shoulder, or maybe even in a bundle, or whatever. And we can be extra confident of this because of these stress studies that have been done on the footprints that show evidence of extra weight bearing on the soles, which is typical of what you find if you're walking and you're holding something fairly heavy.
Right.
Now, curiously, these stress marks and little footprints vanish on the return trip, which means that the child was left wherever this person was going initially. And mind you, this person was not just taking a stroll, enjoying the day. They were in a hurry. So the analysis of the stride shows a human who was briskly walking. They calculate over 1.7 meters or 5.5 feet a second. So this person was really struggling and moving as they were carrying this kid. And I mean, in this sort of environment, you kind of would have to be. There's fossil evidence of dire wolves and panthers, like the so-called American lion, not to mention saber-toothed cats. So all these predators are roaming around, and they were almost certainly capable of attacking people, much less all the big megafaunal herbivores that could be nasty when they wanted to be. And incidentally, we do have evidence of two such animals here. Wow. We have Colombian mammoths, and we have ground sloths, and tracks of both. And just like the human, we have evidence of behavior and possible personality here. And it kind of shows us how these megafauna potentially interacted with humans in this environment. So the mammoths are a bit unfazed. They kind of just cross over the trackway without any hints of recognition that there was a human passing through, just kind of minding their own business perhaps. But the ground sloth, on the other hand, was a lot more cautious. So the trackways show that this animal is going about on all fours, and it walks towards the tracks, and then it stops. And then the forelimb tracks vanish, so it's probably rearing up on its hind limbs, probably to get a better look or maybe catch a sniff here. And then it turns around and it shovels off. So, and we do have evidence that humans hunted ground sloths at this point in time. From the same park, there was another study where they found trackways of people going after a sloth and actually interacting with it, possibly in a hunting context where the sloth is moving around all erratically.
Right.
Mammoths, of course, are rather tough prey to take on, but I mean, there's still evidence here and there that they would have been prey animals too. So these behaviors are really telling and interesting. Now, here's where things are going to get a little bit controversial. In reading this paper, the authors of the study go as far as to use the size of the human footprints to make a determination that the larger printmaker, at least, was a woman, or that what they say an adolescent male, a teenage boy, basically. Now, I really don't want to get too deep into this, but I mean, it has to be said that forensic anthropology, so the kind of stuff that you might see on bones, for example, which is a fun aside because in my anthropology courses, the vast majority of the students were interested because they used to watch Bones when they were younger, and they were like, oh, wait, this is an actual career? Of course, not as action-packed as on the show.
Right.
But forensic anthropology is not always a clear-cut science, and there are enough cases to show that this approach to assigning sex, and I'll just throw in race as well, to skeletal or otherwise remains is very, very tricky. It was a beautiful study of this in one of my forensic anthropology labs that I took, where we had the skull of this adult individual, and we were told, okay, figure out, what race this person was, what ethnicity. Of course, by that point we all recognized the science behind race, which is very, very clear. but nonetheless, like we try to follow the typical forensic anthropologist method, and we were going through all the features that were listed, and okay, well the cheekbones are this sort of size, and the teeth are this sort of size, and all this sort of stuff. And of course, you had folks in the class who were like, "Oh, well, this guy is white. Oh no, this guy is black," and nobody seemed to agree. And then it turns out the teacher turns on us and is like, "Oh, by the way, the skull, this person was Hawaiian." So it's that's a case in point example of why this is not an exact science. And there is a movement now to really fix this field of anthropology and make it more gender inclusive and expansive, and deal with a lot of this problematic methodology. Hence why I made a point to use all those gender neutral terms when I was talking about sexual characteristics in the last episode of the human series. I mean, Homo sapiens is remarkably diverse, and especially within populations. Sexual dimorphism for Homo sapiens is near non-existent, especially when concerned with other hominins like Australopithecus or Precambrian. Whatever features have been proposed to distinguish males and females, they're really insignificant. So just because you have prints from a human with smallish feet doesn't necessarily mean they're a woman, or an adolescent male for that matter. I mean, I honestly question why there is a need to figure this out. I mean, is it really that important to know whether you're looking at a girl or a boy based upon footprints? I mean, these people aren't here to identify themselves. And if you look at the ethnographic literature, we know that sex and gender roles are seen in remarkably different ways across cultures and across time. And often it is the case for these sorts of studies where the authors might be projecting things from their own time and place and culture onto the past. No, that's not to fault the authors of this particular study in any way, but I mean, it's something that I think needs to be called to attention, and I'm not the only one who's done so. So with all this in mind, we really just can't know these things with clarity, and maybe we better not to draw too much attention to it.
Right.
I don't know. What do you think, Albert?
I mean, I would largely agree with all of that for sure. Like it's kind of like we talked about in the last episode of the Human Evolution series. It's so easy to project our current kind of cultural values onto the deep past. And yeah, it's like you said, sexual dimorphism in humans is not that pronounced anyways compared to the other apes. So trying to draw these kind of conclusions is definitely seems pretty shaky in a lot of cases to me as a non-anthropologist. It's that's very true. And it's actually something that those of us who study other fossil organisms have had to deal with too. It's like people have tried to identify sexual dimorphism in extinct species, and even in species that don't really have very close extant analogs. And most of the time, when other people have looked at these cases, it's found that it's nearly impossible. It's very, very difficult to actually say with certainty whether sexual dimorphism was present in a given group of extinct organisms. And in a case like this, where we do know kind of the extent of sexual dimorphism in modern humans, and we know that there's a strongly overlapping kind of distribution in terms of the characteristics involved. I think that's pretty good grounds to be even more cautious.
Yeah, and I tend to agree. And it's funny how prevalent this is too. Like, I mean, just yesterday I saw that they announced a new study where they found, and I wish I had read deeper into this, but they had found a skeleton buried with weapons.
Oh yeah, that's right.
And they were like, "Oh, this," and they looked at the skeleton, of course, and they were like, "Oh, okay, this is a woman,
right.
A woman who was a hunter," which is like, "Oh, what happened? I thought men were supposed to be the hunters, and women the gatherers," and I'm like, "Oh my god, this again." To the credit, like what little I did read, they did bring up a point that there is cases in the ethnographic literature of indigenous groups in the Americas where women did participate in hunts along with men.
Yeah.
So, to their credit, I will applaud them for at least going a little bit deeper into it. But still, the point remains. But on a lighter note, there was a piece of press art made for this story, and some of you may probably know the artist, Karen Carr. Especially if you've seen her work in the Chicago Field Museum's Evolving Planet exhibit, which I finally had the fortune to be able to see last year. And it's fantastic, great exhibit. And of course, her work's seen in other places too. Of course, she goes with the narrative of this paper that this was a woman carrying a child, and that's what you see in the image. And in general, the artwork is pretty nice, save for a few concerns here and there. But I was tasked to make it a little bit better. So if we go to the next slide here. Yeah, so before I go into the backstory behind this, again, it's one of those, and I've talked with a couple of my friends here and there, and with you as well, Albert, the way that we depict ancient humans in artwork, there's a lot to be desired. I mean, I'm looking at the scene right here. This woman is carrying this kid in a no doubt freezing rainstorm, and not only is she barefoot, but like her legs are exposed, and she only has like a skin cloak, if you will, just around her body. Of course, the kid is completely naked. What? This just not make any sense to me. Almost certainly they need some more protection than that. But it's whatever. I digress. But yeah, so again, I mentioned the trackway study that was back in 2018 from the same area, the White Sands National Park, and this was the sloth predation one I was talking about, where the direction and movement of the prints is very telling of a potential ambush and hunt on a sloth with a couple individuals.
Right.
And it was a very fascinating study, in all seriousness. But then the press artwork came out for it, and it just looked hilarious. So I took it upon myself to make it even funnier.
Right.
Because people were making all kinds of comments like, oh, they were surprising it. So I put party hats on everyone, and I hung up a piñata and a disco ball, and threw some confetti here and there, and then boom, it was a surprise sloth birthday party. And everyone loved it, and I was so tickled pink with the coverage. People were sharing it around here and there. Even Dr. Holtz put it on his lecture slides when he went digital earlier this year. So that was sweet. But a little 15 minutes of Twitter fame here. It was kind of nice.
Right.
So then this study comes out, and a lot of the some of the co-authors on the paper, incidentally, as well as fellow folks on Twitter, were asking me like, "Hey, you should, do a similar thing with it." And I was like, "Okay, I'll give it a shot." And I had a couple of ideas, but the biggest one that I had was to take the character Sid from the Ice Age franchise, and I just stuck him in here.
Right.
And well, I mean, if you like Sid as much as I do, which is not very much, you can see why this is pretty funny. So yeah, I just thought I'd share that with you all here.
Right. It is pretty. The most terrifying predator of all.
The annoying John Leguizamo sloth. Should put Alex Lawrence in here too to make it double.
Right.
But no, I mean, in general, this was a really fascinating study. The trackways, the behavior, all of it. I mean, iffy methodology, for putting gender to footprints, but I mean, this is exciting. And as I understand it, there is a lot of new stuff coming from the White Sands National Park. According to some of the press releases, there are some footprints that are in the process of being studied and published where they have children like jumping over mammoth footprints,
Wow.
or kids kind of putting their feet into sloth footprints and
Mm.
kind of playing around. So like play behavior
Yeah.
in Paleoindians, which is that's really cool. I look forward to seeing those papers released when the
Mm.
time
Mm.
comes. But that's all I have to say on this. Albert, if you don't have anything else to add, we can jump right into your next story.
Yeah, sure. I guess the only thing I have to add is, yeah, I agree it's a very fascinating and amazing discovery, and there's just so much information that's contained within this one trackway. Yeah, it's incredible. That's kind of the power of ichnology, or the study of trace fossils. It's just you can see what the trace makers were like when they were alive to a large extent, and it really is an incredible find.
Here, here.
But yeah, I guess we can go on to my second story
Alrighty, next
on the
slide here.
next slide. All right. So I thought the study was pretty interesting. In fact, I had a pretty hard time picking studies for this month because there were quite a few interesting studies that came out. Um, but eventually, I went with this one as one of the studies because I thought it was quite interesting, but wasn't getting that much attention, or rather, the attention it was getting was somewhat superficial, I guess. So um, when this paper was circulated around in the online paleo community, people immediately latched on to the fact that the title of the paper was like, God, it was something like, "Do paleontologists dream of electric dinosaurs?" or something like that.
Mm.
Okay, which quirky reference. Um, and that's pretty much all people pointed out. It was like, "Oh, look at the title. It's kind of funny." Or some people were confused by, like, "Well, what does this have to do with the paper?" But either way, that's kind of where most of the discussion kind of stopped. But I thought the paper was very interesting for other reasons, for what the study was actually about. So I decided to pick this one and talk about it. And so this study was looking at the feasibility of what we call contact incubation in small Mesozoic theropods. Specifically, they were focusing on troodontids, but their methodology would probably apply to many other small Mesozoic theropods as well. So there's a bit of a background we have to go over here. So basically, there have been several specimens of Mesozoic theropods, particularly troodontids and oviraptorosaurs, have been found preserved on top of their nests. The troodontids are these are pretty similar to like dromaeosaurs, like Velociraptor and Deinonychus, but in general they tended to be a bit more gracile, so more slender in terms of their proportions, and probably weren't hunting prey as large relative to their own bodies compared to dromaeosaurids, or at least that's the general thinking. And oviraptorosaurs were a group of very unusual theropods with like these very short skulls. Most of them were toothless, and some of them had these bony crests on their head. Very weird. And in fact, it was the fact that some of these specimens had been found on top of nests that gave them the name Oviraptorosaur, or the original genus that was named, that was Oviraptor, which means egg thief, because it was found on top of a nest of eggs and assumed to have been possibly feeding on those eggs. Well, now that we have many more examples of this type of specimen being found, we've come to realize that it's more likely, due to embryos found inside the eggs, that these are examples of these theropods kind of sitting on top of their own nests and not trying to prey on another dinosaurs. And both the troodontids and oviraptorosaurs were pretty closely related to birds. They would have been, largely feathered across their bodies, and there is evidence that members of these groups had like large, complex feathers coming off of their forelimbs. So they basically would have had very wing-like forelimbs. That even though many, if not all of them, were almost certainly flightless, they could have used these wings for various purposes, like display, or in this case, it has been hypothesized that they use the wings to kind of cover over their nests and cover over their eggs. And since they've been found in these kinds of postures, it has been suggested that this is evidence that these Mesozoic theropods were capable of a type of behavior called contact incubation, which is seen in most types of modern birds today. So, as you almost certainly know, modern birds will sit on their own eggs and use their own body heat to incubate the eggs, and let the warm the developing embryo and allow it to develop to the point of hatching, which is quite different from most other types of reptiles, which tend to just bury the eggs underground and that say the sunlight warm them or for decomposing material in the soil to warm those eggs. So very different incubation strategies. And because these theropods have been found on top of their nests, sitting on top of clutches of eggs, it has been suggested that this kind of contact incubation behavior already evolved in these non-bird theropod dinosaurs, which seems very reasonable. But this hypothesis has not been without its detractors. So there have been a number of arguments that have been put forth in the literature arguing against this interpretation. So one of these is that these eggs, unlike in most modern birds, the eggs of these theropods were not completely exposed in their nests, so they weren't just lying on top of the surface of the ground. What we find is that these evidence that these eggs were partially embedded in the ground, so they were partially buried, so they were kind of sticking partially out of the ground, but like half of them would have been buried under the ground. So that's pretty unusual and pretty different from how modern birds tend to do it. And it has also been suggested that one particular study, at least, they basically calculated the size of the eggs that these dinosaurs could lay, and they not only looked at actually that particular study looked at groups that were even more closely related to modern birds. So things like the opposite birds and the things like Confuciusornis, which were even more closely related to birds and could probably fly. And they based on the anatomy of the hip bones, they calculated the size of the eggs that these Mesozoic theropods could lay, and they argued that their eggs would have been too small to withstand the weight of an adult sitting on top of them. And so they suggested that these Mesozoic theropods might not have sat on their eggs, and instead maybe these examples of adults being found preserved on top of the nests might only been the adults might have only been there to protect the eggs, kind of guarding them, and not they weren't directly like sitting on top of the eggs and incubating them with their own body heat. And another argument that has been made specifically with regards to oviraptorosaurs is that in oviraptorosaur nests, the eggs are arranged in a way that they come in kind of two layers. So the eggs are arranged in kind of a ring around the rim of the nest, and there are two rings of eggs kind of stacked on top of each other. And then people have said, well, since they're stacked in this manner, the adult couldn't have contacted all the eggs at once, and so this would have made kind of contact incubation unlikely, according to those studies. So yeah, there has been some dispute about this hypothesis. And I guess while I'm here, I might as well mention that the term brooding has commonly been used in the paleontological literature to refer to this behavior, this contact incubation. But in the study of modern birds, brooding is more commonly used as a term for parent birds sitting on their chicks, so the babies that have already hatched from their eggs to keep them warm, and not so much the actual incubation of the eggs themselves. So there's a little bit of differing practices in the use of this term. So I've been trying to avoid using the term brooding for that reason here. But either way, yeah, contact incubation works well enough. So this new study by Hogan and Verricchio. So David Verricchio has done a lot of research on kind of the reproductive behaviors of troodontids based on some of these specimens. And in this new study, these authors decided to kind of test these ideas experimentally. And so what they did was that they prepared a couple of chicken eggs, buried them partially in the ground, and then they set up a heated water bath. So they took a water container and put like an aquarium heater in it, and then placed it on top of the eggs. So basically, the heated water container acting as kind of a surrogate parent. And basically, the question they're trying to investigate here is: Does can contact incubation work to incubate partially buried eggs? And to further kind of quantify their results, what they did was they stuck some thermometers inside the eggs, and then they also stuck thermometers at different depths in the sediment that the eggs were sitting on top of. So they had a thermometer where it was just, I think, 5 centimeters below the surface of the ground. They had one that was 10 centimeters below the surface of the ground, and so on and so forth. And they did the setup both indoors. So in the indoor setup, they had basically a tub of sand that the eggs were partially buried in, and the incubator was sat on top of this arrangement. And then in the outdoor setup, what they did was they dug a hole in the ground, filled it with sand, and put the eggs there, and then the incubator on top of that. So they kind of tested it both under indoor controlled condition as well as outdoors. And the diagram I've shown on the slide here shows the kind of experimental setup. So it might be a bit tricky to tell because or to read because the images in this paper were unusually small, but you might be able to see what's going on here with the heated water bath on top of the partially buried eggs, and with thermometers kind of stuck in the ground underneath.
That's so cool. That's like a really neat setup.
Right? Yeah, yeah. It's very it's a very cool way of trying to test this hypothesis. All right, so I guess we can go to the next slide.
Sure.
Right. So here are the results of the. I picked the outdoor trials here, but they have a graph for the indoor trial as well. And so it might be a little bit tricky to figure the graph out, but it's reasonably straightforward. So kind of the x-axis here is the time that's passed since the beginning of the experiment. So this went on for several hours. I think they actually went on for or kept the experiment up for even longer than they show in the graph. But I guess they figured the graph was enough to make their point. So the orange kind of dotted line here shows the ambient temperatures, or the environmental temperature. The white kind of dotted line, which is mostly staying in the middle, were the temperature of the eggs. And the line on top, the blue line, was the temperature of the surrogate parents of the water tub, which was being heated by the water heater. And kind of the colored blocks on the graph show the temperature ranges of different parts of the setup. So the green, for example, shows the temperature of the water. The yellow part is kind of the space between the water tub and the eggs and the sediment. So basically, the heat that's being trapped underneath the water tub. And the various pink and purple blocks below are the temperatures of the sediment at different depths. So what they found was that the surrogate parent, the water tub, could indeed raise and maintain the temperature of these partially buried eggs, even despite the partial burial. They could raise the eggs to a temperature that is closer to the body temperature of the so-called parent than to environmental temperature. And you can see this very well when the ambient temperature starts dipping to rather cold temperatures. In fact, they make the point that these temperatures would have been colder than you would expect for the environment of these troodontids when they were alive. Because this was this was done in a pretty relatively cold, temperate climate. But even then, the temperature of the eggs could be raised to quite high temperatures. Um, I guess just to just to point this out, there have been some studies that have tried to estimate the body temperatures of troodontids and also other types of dinosaurs from the eggshell isotope chemistry. So basically, trying taking the geochemistry of the eggshells and trying to figure out what the body temperature of the dinosaurs were when they produced the eggshells, basically.
Ooh.
And these studies they found a range of temperatures for troodontids, but kind of the 35 degrees Celsius that they show here for the water tub is within the range. And even after it dips to around 30 degrees, that is still kind of within the range that has been estimated for troodontid body temperatures. And they also make the point that it is possible that their water heater was not that powerful, so it might have been more difficult for the water heater to maintain the temperature of the water at above a certain temperature. Um, but in a living animal, of course, they would need to be potentially more efficient than that. So that's kind of a flaw of the experimental design, and that may not necessarily tell us anything about the animals themselves. But even despite this, they found that yes, the eggs could be raised to quite high temperatures, and furthermore, the body heat of the surrogate parent was able to raise the temperature of the sediment underneath to higher than they would be if it weren't there, at least up to a depth of about 15 centimeters below the ground. And of course, you can see here that the effect becomes more diminished when you get deeper underground, as you would expect. But even so, you could see that the body heat, quote unquote, would have been enough to kind of affect the temperature down below there. I think another thing I should mention is that they also wrapped the water tub in the kind of insulating covering, so it basically simulate the effect of feathers, because we know that these dinosaurs probably did have feathers.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess I would say, even if we don't know the exact kind of temperatures that would have been involved in an actual troodontid nest in its natural environment, I do think that this study does provide pretty good evidence that contact incubation could have been effective even for partially buried eggs. And they also point out that the eggs could withstand the weight of the parent, which in this case, the water tub weighed in total about 19 kilograms. And you might not usually expect an egg to be able to withstand that kind of weight, but since a lot of the weight was actually borne in part by the ground, it's quite possible that this allowed the eggs to survive this kind of pressure. And they also point out that in an actual troodontid nest, there would have been many eggs, so the weight of the parent would have been distributed not only between the ground and the eggs, but also between many different individual eggs. And so that would have further kind of lessened the pressure on each egg in itself. And in addition, the eggs kind of point kind of vertically, like the long end is kind of perpendicular to the ground. So this kind of positioning of the eggs would have made them more suited to withstanding, vertical pressure than they would be otherwise. So it seems that simply calculating based on the size of the egg versus the weight of the parent or whatever, that might not give you an accurate idea of how whether or not the eggs could actually withstand an incubating parent's weight. Let's see. I guess we can go to the next slide.
Okay.
So I pulled out this figure because partly because I think it's a very interesting interpretation that they came up with, but also because I think it's a really good figure. It really encapsulates kind of the model that they propose for the evolution of contact incubation very well. And so what they suggest is that since they found that contact incubation could potentially work for partially buried eggs, and furthermore that the body heat of the parent could potentially reach even underground to where relatively deep underneath the sediment, it is possible that the origin of contact incubation involved a process similar to what is shown in this figure here. So ancestrally, um, an ancestral archosaur. So they showed a crocodilian here, but of course the ancestral archosaur was probably not especially crocodilian-like. But because we know that this kind of behavior is seen in crocodilians, it's a reasonable stand-in for this figure. In crocodilians, they don't use their body heat to incubate the eggs. They are um, they mostly stick next to their nests and guard them, but they don't actually use their own body heat to incubate the eggs, and they are ectothermic anyways, so a lot of the time they might not have very high body temperatures with which they can do this. Although, as an aside, there actually are some ectothermic reptiles that are able to contact incubate their eggs, and what they do is they will run outside and bask for a little bit, and then they will go back to their nest and then sit on top of the eggs while their body is warm. Yeah,
I'll be right back. I'll run and grab some heat.
Right, exactly.
That's cute.
Yeah. There are some lizards that do this, especially skinks. Yeah, it's a pretty cool behavior. But in any case, crocodilians don't do this, but nonetheless, they will stick next to their nests and guard them and protect them from predators, and while the eggs themselves are buried inside the nest. And then maybe, just maybe, this gave rise to a later descendant that was endothermic and still practiced this kind of behavior. Maybe it still wasn't incubating its eggs directly with its body heat, but was still guarding its nest. And then this could open the doors to actual contact incubation. So maybe the eggs were buried a bit more shallowly below the ground, and a parent sitting on top of the nest would be able to warm them to some extent. Maybe not a lot, but a little bit, and maybe that little bit would have been enough of an advantage to further select for more specialized contact incubation, and so you get this kind of partially buried nesting arrangement you see in the troodontids and oviraptorosaurs, where part of the egg was exposed, and the parent would sit on top of them and potentially incubate them with body heat. Even though this might not have been as efficient as it is in modern birds, in which there's very strong contact incubation. The eggs are fully exposed above the ground, and the parent kind of fully encapsulates them underneath their body. Which I think this is a very reasonable hypothesis, and they also point out this fact that if there wasn't contact incubation going on in these Mesozoic theropods, it doesn't seem like there would have been that much of an advantage to having partially buried eggs, because if you bury them deeper underground, they would be better protected than if they were partially exposed. So it seems likely that kind of the selection for more exposed eggs is kind of to facilitate contact incubation, or at least that's what they propose. And I think it is quite plausible. One of the things that has kind of puzzled me about the arguments against contact incubation in these dinosaurs is the fact that it's not really clear what alternative mechanism they would propose for incubating the eggs, because if you want to incubate them with the heat of the sun or decomposing soil, it's more efficient to just completely bury them and not leave them partially exposed. So I do think this paper makes a pretty good argument in favor of there being at least some degree of contact incubation present. What do you think?
I think it sounds pretty fair to me.
Yeah. I guess one last thing I will mention is that there was another paper in 2018, which was unusually, I don't think it was cited in this paper, which was pretty unusual, but they found that they were looking at basically the structure of oviraptorosaur nests, and what they found was that in small-bodied oviraptorosaurs, I mentioned how the eggs are arranged in kind of rings around the rim of the nest. Basically, the center of the ring is kind of very small, so the eggs are very tightly packed together, and so if there was a parent sitting there, it would basically be sitting directly on top of the eggs. But in the nests of larger oviraptorosaurs, and oviraptorosaurs could get very big. The biggest species were like over a ton.
Oh yeah.
So like rhino sized. and we have nests from these giant Ovipartorosaurs. The kind of the center of the ring is very, very large, and so it seems like, or at least that's what the previous authors propose, is that perhaps they left this kind of circle in the center for the parent to sit in without actually placing its full weight on top of the eggs, and so in this way it could still kind of sit on top of the nest with all the benefits thereof, without having to kind of get, without having to expose the eggs to the elements or whatever.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, right. So yeah, I think these studies together have provided a fairly convincing case. I think that even if contact incubation was not as well developed as it is in modern birds, and we wouldn't necessarily expect it to be, I do think that it is quite possible that there was some extent of heat transfer going on between the parent and the eggs in these dinosaurs. So I think it's really cool that they were able to test this like in an experimental setup.
Yeah, I love this sort of experimental paleontology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. So I guess I think that's all I have to say about the paper. Do we want to cover yours?
Sure, we can jump right in.
Alrighty. Yeah.
So we'll go to the next slide. Alrighty, the Precambrian.
Ooh.
This is the 4 billion year long prologue to all the cool stuff, the Cambrian explosion and the age of dinosaurs and ice age mammals. I'm kidding, of course. In all honesty, the Precambrian gets a really poor reputation in popular culture. I feel like, at least.
Yeah.
If it's not the formation of the Earth, abiogenesis, snowball Earth, and maybe the Ediacaran fauna, almost everything else gets the short end of the stick. When in reality, this was a very fascinating time that quite literally laid the foundations of the world.
Right.
So for many years now, stratigraphers have divided up this crucial age of our planet in a very clear system of eons, eras, and periods. We have the informal Hadean eon, because there are technically no rock remains from this period, and then the formally named Archean eon and Proterozoic eon. The former, when we do have a proper rock record, and the latter when we start seeing an oxygenated atmosphere and more complex organisms. Now, just when life is supposed to have originated on Earth is one of the biggest mysteries of modern science.
Right.
And we have earlier and earlier dates that have been proposed based on varying evidence. And should these early dates become validated with more study, the implications, I think, are very grand. Life might be an inevitable phenomena in the universe, much as star formation or the origin of worlds like planets. Now, the current system is cemented by the International Commission on Stratigraphy, and this follows work from the 1980s, which gives the Archean eon 4 eras and the Proterozoic 3, with the Proterozoic earning the right to have proper periods. Now, all of these individual subdivisions were put in place thanks to the studies on the cyclical nature of sedimentation, the process of mountain building, or orogeny as it's called, and the magnetism of the rocks. Now, nearly all of the associated dates for these eras and periods come from a process called chronometry, which is where the times are measured based on the absolute date of a particular rock or mineral specimens. And this is opposed to chronostratigraphy, where the times derive from the actual rock layers and their associated fossils. In the current time scale, everything beyond the cryogenian period of the Proterozoic eon is dated in this way, with corresponding rock layers and for everything, whereas everything before that gets these chronometric dates. And this has led to quite a number of concerns, most specifically that the chronometric dates no longer correspond to the geologic events that the various eras and periods were named after. And there's been a lot of great work done on Precambrian rocks since these ages were named and established in both the geologic and the biologic fields. And this is enough for a team of workers in 2012, geologist, I'm going to have to pronounce this right, Van Kranendonk and colleagues, apologies for mispronunciation, This has led this team to propose a new timescale for the Precambrian, with new dates and new names and an entirely new scheme for all of them. Now, this initial announcement went without official acceptance, so to kind of see this new 2020 paper here arguing for the same sort of proposal is, I guess, it's sort of a let's try this again situation. And I do need to make this very clear, as you can see in the bold. This paper is so new that it's still in the preprint stage and is currently undergoing peer review, which, if you remember, is the universal process that all scientific papers go through to weed out all the nonsense and potential errors in study. So we'll just have to see where this goes. Personally, to me, I think what we have here is really great. And I've looked around, I've asked some friends, and they generally agree that the scheme works really well. It's a lot better than what we already have. So I'd love to see it implemented. And if it does turn out that this is accepted officially, this would make it the biggest change to the geologic timescale since the reworking of the Cenozoic era, where it was originally the Tertiary and the Quaternary, and now we get Paleogene and Neogene and so forth.
Right.
Now, to kind of help flesh out this system and explain what we're looking at, I'm going to go through each of the 3 eons, and I'm going to share what's been proposed in this new system, as well as kind of give a crash course on Precambrian history, which I hope comes in handy for all you listeners out there. So let's jump into the next slide here. So here is the Hadean Eon, the first of the eons, and the time when the Earth and the rest of the solar system formed. Now the name refers to Hades, who is the Greek god of the underworld, as well as the name of his kingdom, which was always kind of odd to me, because like in the Greek myths, Hades is supposed to be this sad, desolate place that's kind of damp and foggy and cold, and there's ghosts everywhere. But then it's often conflated with the Christian idea of hell, where everything's on fire and it's hot and molten and it's all dynamic and woo.
Yes.
So it's just weird. I've never understood this. But, just going with this idea, it is generally understood that this early period of the planet's formation was a typically molten time. Now, contrary to traditional depictions, things like Disney's Fantasia, the entire Hadean probably wasn't like this all the way through. We do have evidence of surface water fairly early on, so the Earth was not this red and orange ball for many, many millions of years, only for a limited time. Now, the beginning of the Hadean is essentially the beginning of the Earth, so roughly 4.567 billion years ago, and it conventionally ends around 4 billion years ago. But again, it needs to be noted that these particular dates have not been formally defined. There were no eras or periods coined for the Hadean in the current geologic time scale. So what makes this new proposal interesting is that we at least get 2 eras for the Hadean. The first one is named the Chaosian, due to the chaos of the Earth's formation, which is very fitting because this is the time when a Mars-sized planetary body, or perhaps multiple bodies, slammed into the planet at just the right angle as to produce this ring of material that coalesces and forms the moon. And we have good evidence both from moon rocks and from our Earth that demonstrate that this event happened, and it was insanely massive. And then this particular era ends with the formation of the very earliest materials ever found in the geologic record. These are detrital zircons from Western Australia, 4.404 billion years ago. And these zircons are very small, and the oxygen signatures within them show underwater origins. So by this time, it seems the oceans had formed. Now from there, we get to the next era, of which we have 2 names that have been proposed. The Jackhillsian, after the Jack Hill site, where those particular zircons were found, or the Zirconian, which, again, for the zircons. The zircons are important here, basically, is what I'm saying. During this era, whatever name is chosen, we begin to see the beginnings of the rock cycle and the formation of oceanic, or what's called mafic crust. The late heavy bombardment continued, so the last of the embryonic planetesimals from the birth of the solar system, from this sort of swirling nebula of gas and dust, were raining down on the planet because the planet's gravitational pull was pulling all of these smaller and smaller pieces into it. So lots of explosions as the Earth was finishing up its formation. So we jump to the next slide here, and we have the Archean eon. And this certainly gets a bit of a touch-up. Conventionally, we have 4 eras named, but no period subdivisions. And these were named, again, without any formal explanations for the dates chosen to divide these up. The Archean gets its particular name from the ancient Greek word for beginning, or if you like, origin. And that's because it's now that we begin to see proper continental, or felsic crust, as well as the first definitive evidence for biological life on the Earth. Now, for this new system, the first of the eras, the Eoarchean of the old geologic timescale, is abandoned, just to kind of keep things simple and remove any ambiguity with the end of the Hadean eon. So now we have it simplified to 3 eras. The Paleoarchean begins with the oldest known rocks, that is, pieces of continental crust, which are the Acosta gneiss from northwest and eastern Canada, and these are dated to 4.30 billion years ago. Of course, given the violent churning of the Earth's surface during the subsequent periods following this, there was probably older continental crust than this, but have since been destroyed and recycled in the churning of the Earth.
Yep.
So with this evidence, we get the name for the first period, the Acostan. And then next up, 3.810 billion years ago, is the Iseuan period, after the Isua greenstone belt of Greenland. And it's in this location where we see some of the first supracrustal sedimentary rocks, which are formed through chemical processes in the ocean. And we also find stromatolites here, very early evidence of living things. And again, there's potential chemical evidence of life on Earth going back to the Hadean eon at the most, but they're super controversial. It's a question whether these are actually formed by biological organisms or from some other geochemical process that we know little of. But by this time, at least, we can be sure that life was making a home on Earth over 3 billion years ago. Now, at 3.490 billion years ago, we get the next era, the Mesoarchean, and the next era, which is, or the next period, I should say, which is the Valbaran. Now, this name is an amalgamation of 2 Craton names, the Cupval of South Africa and the Pilbara of Australia. Cratons are these pieces in the lithosphere that have remained relatively stable for grand periods of time. Hence the term stable continental nuclei that you can see here on the chart under the main events section. Really good fossilized evidence of life comes from this time. Various prokaryotic fossils from Western Australian chert. Now, the next period, at 3.20 billion years ago, is the Pongolan, after the Pongola supergroup. Now, this is a South African sequence of metamorphic and sedimentary rocks that is the oldest of its size, hence a supergroup. This tells us that large parts of the continents were more or less fairly stable in their overall composition. They were no longer being subjected to the kind of roiling, churning recycling of earlier times. If these were to change dramatically, now they had to do so via plate tectonics, or the building up of sedimentary rock layers. The Mesoarchean era ends 2.780 billion years ago with the start of the Methanian period, and this name honors some of the most common forms of life at the time, methanotrophs, and these are prokaryotes that use methane for their metabolic processes. Now, the continents are beginning to really grow in size and composition, and these large flood basalts appeared, where volcanoes just poured out huge flows of lava over the landscape. After which, now we have the Silurian period, and this is actually borrowed from the current time scale, but then relocated into the Archean. So it used to be part of the Proterozoic, but now they're arguing to put it in the Archean. So kind of like what happened with the Pleistocene. where the last age of the Pliocene is now included into the Pleistocene. The Silurian period gets its name after the Greek word for iron, because here we get the first banded iron formations. Now, that whole process, it's this rusting that occurs. So you have free oxygen atoms that are absorbed into the ocean, and they react to the bits of dissolved oxygen that are floating around, and they become thus iron oxides. And these sink to the ocean floor, and they produce this sort of reddish rust. And over time, as this happens, all that iron builds up and produces these bands in the sediment that are really beautiful, hence banded iron formations. And so the oldest of these mark the start of the new Silurian period, 2.630 billion years ago. Since by this point we have photosynthesizing prokaryotes, we now have sources of free oxygen on the Earth's surface. So if we jump to the next slide, finally, we have the Proterozoic eon. And here things are more conservative while still being radically different. But by that I mean the three eras that we have remain, but now they're all redated, and the periods have been rearranged or supplanted. So 2.420 billion years ago, with the Paleoproterozoic era, we have the Oxygenian period. It's now that we begin to see a noticeable rise in atmospheric oxygen, because there's only so much iron in the oceans to produce all of this rust before all those oxygen atoms just start leaking into the sky, eventually giving us our nice blue skies that we have today. It's with the, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, the Precambrian formation in Africa that we find evidence of a glaciation event that marks the first time we see significant ice on the Earth's surface. This event, which is tied to the larger Huronian Ice Age, is where you have this increase in atmospheric oxygen that actually reduces the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And so now the Earth is beginning to cool sufficiently enough to facilitate the growth of ice sheets such as these. Now next up, 2.250 billion years ago, we have another period where we have two names that are proposed. And so it can either be the Getulian, which is named after the Lomagundi Getuli Delta 13 carbon isotopic excursion event. Basically, this means that there's this significant geochemical process that made a crap ton of limestone and dolostone, which then buried a lot of carbon and produced a lot of oxygen. Chemistry stuff. I wish I was a little bit more well-versed in. But then the other proposed name is the Eukaryan, because it's at this point that we find the earliest evidence for the evolution of eukaryotic organisms, which are distinguished from prokaryotic organisms in that they store their DNA in a nucleus, and they have all these different organelles and so forth. Eukaryotes seem to have arisen from the fusion of two prokaryotes, so an archaea that swallowed an alpha proteobacterium, which was not digested and used to help with energy. And so they became the powerhouse of the cell, or the mitochondria. This is a process that's just known as endosymbiosis. Eukarya, of course, is the group that includes plants and fungi and animals, as well as the so-called protists, so things like amoebas and euglemas. Now, thanks to our dear friend Meg Dixon, I'm able to remember the true stars of this Eukaryan period, the Franzvillian biota, or what we call the French villains. These are these really weird fried egg-looking things that have been found in rocks, and they have no known classification. They're very clearly multicellular, but they might not even be eukaryotes. It's crazy. Who knows what these things are? So following this, 2.60 billion years ago, is the Columbian period, after the first proposed supercontinent that formed on the Earth called Columbia. Incidentally, this supercontinent is also known as Nuna, or Hudson Land, both of which are certainly better names. I mean, goodness knows Christopher Columbus doesn't need more praise.
You're right.
So from here, we come to the Middle Era, the Mesoproterozoic, at 1.780 billion years ago. In the current geologic timescale, this time has 3 periods. However, according to the authors of this particular study, this was a time of relative stability on the Earth. This is where we get the so-called boring billion. Of course, this is an oversimplification. There were some notable geologic processes going on, not to mention the further evolution of eukaryotic life. I mean, what's so boring about the rise of plants that photosynthesize, right? You have another endosymbiotic event going on during this time, where a cyanobacterial cell fuses to a eukaryotic cell, and so gives rise to red algae and green algae and on to the land plants we know today. So despite all of this, there is still a notable lack of material, both geologic or biological, that would help with further subdivision. So for now, this system argues for just a single period for this time, what they call the Rhodinian, which is after another supercontinent that formed called Rodinia. And lastly, the Neoproterozoic era. Now we're getting to enter some familiar territory.
Right.
We've had some very good chronostratigraphic localities to help with subdividing this era. And so this stretch of time has more or less been left alone in this new system, save for the removal of the Tonian period, which originally opened the Neoproterozoic. The Tonian was named for a lithospheric event that has now been dated earlier in the Mesoproterozoic, following the breakup of the Rodinia supercontinent. So probably good to just kind of leave that at the doorstep. Now for this, we retain then the 2 later periods, the aforementioned Cryogenian of 720 million years ago. This is the time of snowball Earth, which may have been multiple events or might have been just one event. It's a bit up in the air. And then the Ediacaran period of 635 million years ago. And it's during this time that we get the first evidence of animal life, resembling sponges, as well as the Ediacaran fauna, our good friends Spriginia and Charnia and Dickinsonia, for which we have no idea what they are or who they're related to. They're clearly eukaryotes, but do they represent this entire lineage of life that is now completely extinct, or do each of these creatures have separate clades that they belong to? That's a bit of a good question. Nobody knows, and there's all sorts of ideas. But in any case, it's right when the Ediacaran period ends, 451 million years ago, that all of these particular organisms die out. And then they're replaced by the more recognizable, but almost certainly just as strange, animals of the Cambrian period, which of course is part of the Phanerozoic Eon, and I'll go ahead and stop because I think you all know the rest of this story from here. All in all, I think this is a really beautiful timescale. It really merges the eras and the periods with actual events on the ground in a way that the Phanerozoic's eras and periods and epochs have done, which is super helpful for educational purposes. I know this particular proposal has been floating around for years now, but I honestly, I really hope that it gets seriously considered. There are a number of researchers out there that I've read about that study the Precambrian, and I think if we go with this, then it's just going to open it up to more and more future scientists to study this great stretch of our planet's history. Make it more accessible and interesting. Albert, I've been going on and on about the Precambrian, but I would love to hear your input on this.
Yeah, no, I agree. I can get on board with this new proposal. I think they've chosen some very good, markers for splitting up these different time periods, and I hope that this does get kind of official consideration eventually. So I guess in addition to probably submitting it to peer review, I guess the new proposal might also have to go through the official kind of group in charge of the official geologic timescale is the International Commission on Stratigraphy, and it can take a little bit of time to push things through that system. But I think it makes a lot of sense to divide the Precambrian up this way, and I definitely wouldn't complain if this was adopted.
Yeah, same here. Well, alrighty, great. I think that's it for me. I'll jump to the next slide and we can give our acknowledgments. Of course, the music and the color scheme for Avatar goes to our friends Henry and Alicia. Thank you very much. And for this particular episode, I do want to bring attention to 4 individuals. So going in order of the names here. Melissa Macias, who is a self-proclaimed sloth-obsessed paleontologist. Anthony J. Martin, who's an ichnologist and the author of books Dinosaurs Without Bones and The Evolution Underground, which I have read here and there. They're very wonderful. Sally C. Reynolds, who is the head of the Institute for Studies of Landscape and Human Evolution at Bournemouth University, who was also a co-author on the footprint study that we talked about. And then Jan Thomas, who's a natural history blogger at Mostly Mammoths, and we'll put a link in the description for you to check out their work. They have been nothing but kind and supportive to me, and their high enjoyment of these little art edits that I've done for these footprint studies. It just puts a big grin on my face, and I just wanted to thank them and send them my appreciation. I think it'd be actually a neat idea if we ever decide to incorporate interviews into our show, that we can bring some of them on and talk about their work.
That would be fun, yeah.
Yeah, so there's my little shout out there. And then on the next slide, of course, the usuals, follow us on Twitter and YouTube. And if you have questions for us, please feel free to shoot us an email, timeandclades@gmail.com. And as always, the references for the papers we've talked about on this show can be found in our description. Let's see. Next week, Albert, we're going to be talking about bird evolution again, right?
Yeah, I believe so. Yes. So we'll get to one of my favorite clades, Strysauries, which I've written a couple of papers about now. So I am looking forward to talking about them next week. Yep.
Yeah, and then after that should be the next episode of the Human Evolution series,
right,
where I talk about the origins of the genus Homo and the subsequent stuff about that. So I'm excited. We thank you all so much for joining us today, and we hope to see you again very soon.
Indeed. Take care.
Bye, everybody.